people would walk by and laugh at me, like blatantly. And this last one I went to, I think, is the first time I've ever gone to this specific series of conferences and not been laughed at. Things don't change without leaders.
Have you ever felt like people didn't get you, your values, or maybe your ideas? I have. All three. And so has our guest today, who was recommended by a previous guest, Dr. Emily Junker. Dr. Laurie Dohmen went to UPenn for vet school with a huge love for equine medicine, but quickly became a mixed animal house call vet, learning to love companion animal medicine. One day, she told her husband that if I'm going to say that my practice is an extension of my family, I better start making that so. She started to get training in acupuncture, food therapy, herbal medicine, studying under the most well-known herbalists, and completing her Master's of Science in Therapeutic Herbalism. She is also published frequently in peer-reviewed journals. Realizing there was a huge gap for training and continuing education on veterinary herbal medicine, she created the only hands-on veterinary herbal medicine course for Western veterinary practices in the United States. I think there is something on the horizon for integrative practices. If you have ever wanted to learn in depth on integrative medicine, make sure to check out our course at purplemoonherbstudies.com and sign up before January 1st, as prices will increase then. I'll put links, like always, in the description below. Now, let's get to the conversation with Dr. Laurie Dohmen. You're kind of a farm girl, right?
Yes. Yep. When we moved to Kentucky when I was 3.5, my mother said, "Oh, we're in Kentucky. We need to learn to ride horses." And I think to this day, she still regrets it. She's a New York City girl, and I am completely a Kentucky farm girl. So,
Well, so I actually rode horses when I was little too, and there's just something special about a girl and her horse. So, but it sounds like you took it to the extreme because you really did latch on to horses. It sounded like kind of your calling from a very young age. Is that true? When did you know you wanted to get into vet med?
yes. It was always horses, and my mother is actually a nurse practitioner, so medicine kind of came from there. And I was eventing really competitively, and I did actually have to make a choice to pull back on my riding so that I could do the academics required to go to veterinary school. So
I did that too. That's so funny. And I thought the other interesting things is, and again, back to when you were a young age, you got to hang around the barns and you were working in barns. And I didn't even know that you worked with racetracks. You rescued a horse from the racetrack.
So I went to college, to Mount Holyoke College, which has a riding program. That's one of the best riding programs in the country. And that's part of why I went there, was to be able to still do the academics and yet get back to horses and all of that. And by the time I graduated my undergrad, I had adopted a horse from the school, or she adopted me, to be more fair. I have to tell you this story. She would nicker when my car pulled in the parking lot. She was the last stall next to the parking lot. She would be in other lesson programs, and she would stop dead and stare at me if she saw me anywhere. She once laid down with a different rider on her and just was like, "I'm not going. You will not ride me." So she picked me. I didn't pick her, and I had her until she passed away a few years ago. But so when I came down back to Penn for vet school, I was absolutely looking for a place for my horses, and I found a place that I was really happy with. And then the woman who was taking care of the barn moved to Delaware, and I moved my horses with her, and she merged with a racetrack guy, and they were like, "This is great experience for you." So I went to the racetrack and I worked, and I got to, shadow a vet there and exercise horses for money on the racetrack. And and in the process, in my third year of vet school, there was this horse that was just like stunning. I mean, just stunning. And I was in love with her. And one day her rider said to me, "He's about to send her to slaughter. Her knee is broken." And I stood in that man's barn until he gave her to me. And then I stood in that man's barn again until he gave me the papers for her, so she was legally mine. And I took the x-rays too. I was in third year large animal intensive. Penn does it where you do a quarter that's just intensive, large animal intensive, small animal, and they're optional, or you can go early into rotations, but I was in large animal intensive and I walked up to the lecturer that day, one of the surgeons. I said, "Can you fix this?" He said, "Yup." And I trailed her straight to surgery. So, and had her knee scoped.
What a
So,
cool story. And it sounded like you had some really good mentors going through vet school when it came to like equine and large animal.
yes, Dr. Ross was the one who, Michael Ross, did the surgery on my horse. And because she needed further joint injections, Adequan and such, he gave me privileges and the bandaging and all of that. He knew I knew how to do it for my own horse. So when I was in rotations, I did a lot with him anyway, because, I thought he was excellent, which he is. And he let me do things that he didn't let other students do because he knew I had the experience and the knowledge to do it, having done it first on my own horse. So that was a really nice bonus of it all.
The other thing that I heard, and I wanted to bring this up because when someone asked me like, how was your vet school experience? I'm very honest and say it was probably one of the hardest 4 years of my life. And I think some people's knee-jerk reaction is like, "Oh, it was great."
Okay.
I know, right? It's like, but you had a very unique experience on the small animal side that I wanted to kind of ask you a little bit more about. And it wasn't the best experience, but I think it shows a lot about you and kind of being able to interpret the situation and say what felt right to you. And I don't know if that helped your next steps at all, but there was a rotation. I think you said it was internal medicine where you had to talk to a client and you said that renal disease is not curative.
Right.
And they got upset with that comment. So you can elaborate if you want to tell more to that story, but I'm just kind of curious what that did to you and if that impacted you at all in your decisions kind of going forward.
So as wonderful as I felt my experience at New Bolton was, not just because of Dr. Ross, but, I felt that it was warm and nurturing, and really I learned a ton. Was as awful as I felt UPenn Small Animal Hospital was from start to finish. I felt the classes were unsupportive. And then we got into rotations. We'd never been taught to do a physical examination. Like, I'd never palpated an animal, and I was just turned loose and expected to do this. And yes, and then I hit internal medicine, and I told a client that, renal failure was very treatable and we could keep his cat alive for a very long time, but it was not curable. And they pulled me into the back, never let me interact with another client, and gave me a C in the rotation. They couldn't fail me because I think they realized then they would have had legal ramifications of me telling the truth, but they did the next best thing they could do. Everything at Penn, we fix everything. That's kind of the motto, and that's just not factually accurate.
Did you have any type of, my guess is no, holistic or herbal or anything when you went into or going through vet school at all? Or
So one of my friends now is a doctor named Dr. Judith Schumacher. And at New Bolton, she was known as the quack down the road, and everybody made fun of her. So that was my only experience. And she knows this, she and I have talked about it. She's, and we just laugh about it now. But yes, that was my only experience in veterinary school. So, and my mother, I came from very US biopharmaceutical medicine. So it was, I don't know, but something was always in me that was not the path for me.
so when did you start to gain interest in maybe finding other ways of treatment options, or did that come from your personal life? Like, were you interested in picking certain foods for you and your family? How did that kind of transition into your work?
The whole biopharmaceutical thing never really felt comfortable for me. I always used fewer vaccines, less medicine, tried to find ways to go around it. I would never use a new pharmaceutical on the market unless it had been on at least 5 years, which in some cases probably saved a lot of my animals' lives. Some of the products ended up to be good, but you know how many things come on the market and they get pulled off very quickly. So I was never comfortable with that. And my best friend from vet school, Dr. Carol Falk, did an internship and then immediately went holistic. She went through the Chi University and did all the Chinese and kept saying, Laurie, you should do this, you should do this. And when my husband and I started having kids, I was already, like I said, judicious in vaccines and everything for animals. So we really researched vaccines. I made my own baby food, etc. And I said to him, I always say my practice is an extension of my family. And if it is, then I need to treat it accordingly. And with a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old, which my husband may still never forgive me for, I went back and retrained from top to bottom. And, I'm glad I did. So, and it's not that I don't use pharmaceuticals, I'm very integrative. It's just that now I have a lot more alternatives and a lot more tools in my toolbox, as a lot of holistic people like to say. So I have a lot more options.
Hey, I think options are fantastic. The worst thing you want to get to is, well, it's either this really expensive surgery or nothing, you know? So having
Right.
options, I think, is important. You went right into a mobile practice after vet school as well.
Yes.
So what kind of interests you in that type of practicing?
So I planned to be straight equine. And then I moved down here to Delaware, which is farm country, and everybody has, a backyard farm. Because I wasn't looking to do racetrack medicine, even though I had some experience in it. I had just enough experience to know that, it wasn't where my career was going. So it's all, backyard pet animals. And then they'd be like, well, can't you just look at my dog, or can't you take care of my barn cat, vaccinate my barn cats? And so it went from an equine practice to a mixed animal house call practice pretty quickly. And I found what I really liked doing were companion animals. So my practice name is Companion Animal Practice. And, it didn't really matter species. I didn't want to do working animals. I didn't want to do food animals. I wanted to do people's companions. And so then it became less about species and more. And I think that goes to the holistic too. And being in people's environment gives you a better examination, because you see so much more behavioral and lifestyle and what they're really eating and etc. You get a bigger picture when you're in their house, and you see them in their environment, so you see them as they are, not the scared or angry or whatever animal that comes into a clinic. I mean, I did go on and have a clinic, but I think I prefer house call medicine when I have the choice.
And your relationship with the client, I would imagine, is also kind of special because when you have someone come into your home, that there's some vulnerability to that. And so I don't know, did you find kind of like the relationship with clients was a little special too?
Yes, it's funny. They invite you in like you're a guest. Do you want anything to eat? Do you want to drink? And it's like, no, I'm here to work. It's almost like you have to have more of a boundary while also being more personal. So it was a fine line, and sometimes it works and sometimes it just gets awkward, And sometimes you end up with friends, because you've been in their space so much, eventually it evolves to, where they really become your friends. So it can run the gambit, but overall I think it's a good thing. But
Mm.
I do think it takes a personality that's prepared to have boundaries, because those boundaries are much more blurred when you're in somebody's house than when you're in a room.
Yeah. When you walk into somebody else's hospital space, there's like that door, that threshold that you cross,
Right.
that this is not my area. So yeah, that makes sense. So pros and cons, good perspective. The other thing I wanted to ask too is, you go to Delaware for your horses, and and your husband is not in any type of veterinary medicine. So
None.
how did you two meet? I was just curious to ask that question.
No, this actually is great. So I was making house calls and I was driving around listening to the radio, and he was the personality on the radio, and I liked what he had to say. And I always say I still do. We've been married 22 years and 23 years, something like that. And I still like what he has to say. So yeah.
Aw. So, like, did you call in and say, "Hey, I like what you did?"
One of his coworkers was my client, and I went and I was asking, and I was trying to be all cool and ask about, all the people on the radio, but the wife was smarter than that. And long story short, she hooked us up and we've been together ever since. So, yeah.
Aw. I love that too. And hey, you never know, your client may be able to set you up.
Right.
Well, going back to the integrative approach, I like you told this to me that you coming out of vet school and probably right after your small animal rotations, you're like, I am never going back to school. I am
Right.
done with this. But you just kind of had to find where what you wanted to study, and it sounds
Yeah.
like you're a huge learner. So you start doing classes and studying on integrative approaches and the herbal medicine, everything. But I mean, there wasn't a lot in veterinary, so you were going through human aspects. So I'm really curious to hear more about that experience being a veterinarian, going through, you know, things that were supposed to be targeted for people, and how did you learn to translate that to where you wanted to practice? I mean, you can always take that for yourself personally back to your family, but when it came to translating it back into the different species you work with, how was that process?
So one thing I will say kudos to Penn for is they taught veterinary medicine very much including humans as another species. So I think we learned a decent amount of human medicine. I'm not talking about diseases and stuff like that, but like anatomy and physiology. I think humans were not 100% included, but very often used for comparison.
Mm,
So I think I had a good understanding of, just like we learned the differences between a cat and a dog, I think I had a little more translational ability there. I did take IVIS, which was strictly veterinary for my acupuncture, but I think that also helped because you had to then translate Chinese medicine, and the Chinese medicine is non-species specific. So, I think all these things put together made it easier for me to see connections. And I think I started on more the physiology level during my herbal masters. I did an herbal apprenticeship first with Rosemary Gladstar, and then I went on and got my master's. I sat in on a course about sports nutrition, and I could see herbs for the physiology of the actual muscles. And muscles are muscles. And I had actually written in vet school a paper on fast twitch and slow twitch muscle, and all of that fit into it. So I think it started translating there and then building it up into the whole animals, became easier and easier. But you and I talked when we spoke before about Susan Wynn, who we both know. When I was trying to figure out how to translate all of this into veterinary, I met her at a holistic conference, and I said, where do you learn to do herbs for animals? And she said, oh, you don't. You just learn human and you just translate it yourself. And that was the moment I knew I was going to write a course because there needs to be a course. It's not that easy for everyone to translate. People's brains are different, people do things differently. And there needs to be a hands-on veterinary course. And it was then that I knew I was going to write it someday in the future.
and you're able to bring the different types of practicing medicine together as well, that I think could make it more approachable for a larger audience. Because when I was looking at all the different people that you've studied under, to be honest, I don't recognize any of them. So they're probably like huge celebrities in
Yeah.
certain circles, just like us. I go to a conference, and I took my husband to VMX last year, and we're in the expo hall, and I see Dr. Chrisman walk by, and I'm like, "Oh, that's a really famous veterinarian." And my husband's like, all right.
Yeah.
So so for someone who isn't as knowledgeable in that area, we don't understand like how big that is,
Right.
but you're able to kind of marry these two. And I think you've said that you get asked to speak at a lot of conferences because you know how to like balance all of this information and make it digestible for like multiple audiences, which I really appreciate as well. Rosemary sounds very, very interesting. The way you described her as just being such a lovely human being and just had this presence that, you were happy to be in her presence, I thought was really neat. Were you one of her first veterinary individuals that she had as a student?
Actually, I was her second.
Second.
Again, when my children were young, I was reading more holistic magazines, and there was this one called Body and Soul, which has since been unfortunately discontinued because it was a lovely magazine. And they did a story about her. I mean, she is the godmother of herbalism in the USA. So she's, like herb companies are all named for her, schools are named for her. She's definitely our fairy godmother, and I'm lucky to have her as a mentor and a friend. But the expose talked about her apprenticeship and that it was a home study and then weekends. And they mentioned a vet who had taken it. And I was like, huh. And I tried to call the vet, and it winds up he's her personal vet, and 'cause in the neighborhood. And he was on some extended trip and out of the country for like 3 months or something. So I never spoke with him. But I was like, what the heck? It wasn't very expensive. And I started the home study and I was like, this woman's a little quirky. I'll go to the apprenticeship, I've paid for it. And if I hate it, I just won't go back for all the weekends. And I like, it was instant love with her, with the course, with the material. The things that sound quirky on paper are what make her so beautiful as a human being. And it was just an amazing experience, and I'm really glad I did it because she's what is called a folk herbalist, so she does it from a very hands-on, in your kitchen kind of aspect. Even though she probably knows more medicinal systems than me, she certainly knows traditional Chinese medicine, she knows Ayurveda, knows more tons more Native American than I do. Her grandmother was Armenian, so that was her background. She's incredibly educated, but she comes across as just doing it in her kitchen. So then when I was thinking about getting my master's, I actually called her up and I said, should I do this? And she said yes. And then she was right because it gave me the science side of it, which is very important for us as doctors. And especially, like you said, talking to people, that's the language we learned. So speaking that language is always very useful. But I still teach the practical aspects from the folk way, which I think is better when you're working with the herbs. So I'm able, like you said, to marry. I think part of why I can marry things is because I learned two different ways of doing herbs. I learned a very didactic scientific way, and I learned a very down home folk way. And so putting those together already had me putting, different schools of thought together. And I'm passionate about both. And just a funny aside story. So I was at a conference since I've spoken to you last, and a vet came up to me and he's like, I'm really interested in this. I'm really interested, but is there research? And I was sitting in front of my computer and I said, sit down. I said, pick an herb. And he picked one that I had talked about in the lectures I gave. And I typed it into PubMed and there were like 253 references. And he just went like this, just like that. He's like, okay, I'm sold. Like, yes, there is research. This is, they take the folk information and then study it and show the science behind it, which I think is kind of cool that basically they're proving what we all already know about the plants. So,
I am fascinated by understanding how much research there really is. And a lot of these have been used for much longer than a lot of our traditional medicines have been used. So I guess what I'm hearing some of my colleagues say in the back of my head is, but have they been studied in the species that we work with? And so I guess when it comes to research in, like, say, cats or dogs, how comfortable do you feel there that we have the data that we need?
very comfortable, very, very comfortable for two reasons. One is there is a decent amount of research out there, but two is, like you said, these medicines have been used for thousands upon thousands of years. And the cultures that have used them, including, all of our cultures, use them not only in humans, but in their animals. So the stories, the history is there, and the information where it can't be used in a certain species, where it's toxic, where the dosage is different, is already out there because of evidence-based medicine. And as vets, we don't realize how much evidence-based medicine we do. And this is something I lecture about. I don't know if you remember 10 or 15 years ago, maybe 20 by now, the FDA tried to say that we could only use drugs on label for species that they were labeled for. And Big Pharma came out and said, no, 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 because we're not prepared to label euthanasia solution for every species that is out there. And so the FDA came back with, if you can find 3 vets that use it the same way you do, you are in compliance with the law. And that's where the law stands today for us as veterinarians. So every time we give a rabies shot to something that isn't a dog, a cat, or a ferret, because that's all that's on IMRAB, we know we are comfortable doing that, knowing evidentially, if that's a word, there are 2 other vets doing it the same way. In fact, there's thousands of vets giving horses IMRAB, right? But the law says we only have to find 3 vets doing it the same way. So in that, if we look at the history of the herbs, there's way more than 3 people who have used them in their animals, and the historical evidence is there, and there's a lot of research into how traditions are using it, and then they take that research and start to study it in whatever species they're studying it in. So
Mhm.
yes, it's there. So,
Listening to all the things that are in the course that you have created, which also it's hands-on, it's an experience. Actually, now that you talked a little bit about Rosemary's structure, it sounds a little bit like that too, that you've got, the weekends and it's very hands-on.
yes, I actually based the class half on my apprenticeship with Rosemary Gladstar and half on IVIS. Those were my templates for how I put the scheduling and the timing together of the class.
And you talked about one of the things that got you into holistic practicing was your belief of your work was an extension of your personal values. It was part of your family. And part of the sessions when I was hearing all the different courses, which sound like so much fun, you had also like well-being
Yeah.
sessions. And
Self-care.
yes, that was part of the whole experience as well. Would you like to speak a little bit about that and why you have that also incorporated into your courses?
I actually can't take credit for that. I co-wrote the course with Dr. Kris August, who comes from Waldorf schools, and she also has a graduate diploma in veterinary herbalism online. So she knows the herbs as well as I do. And the Waldorf experience kind of gave her the hands-on, because they did a lot of stuff with herbalism and with plants in that. So she came at it differently, but similarly in a strange way. But she's always been about self-care. She is a hospice certified vet. She actually wrote part of the hospice course in the hospice text. And I think that hospice is kind of ahead of the rest of us on looking at that. I think if you do hospice and end of life, you need to really take care of yourself. But I'm very linear. So my course would have been a lot more rigid and more straightforward. And she really brought in, I mean, for herbalism would have still been folk, but she really brought in the extras and the beauty and the softening of it. And some of that is self-care. And as we look at not one more vet and all these kinds of things, and we see how important it is to take care of ourselves, that part of the course has gained importance for me. And I've had students who've said, I only signed up for this because it had the self-care part. And also where we teach, I was really tied to teaching in the Outer Banks of North Carolina. And the first time I brought Kris down, it was right after a hurricane, and I mean, the place was just a disaster, but it was when she could come and when we had planned, and even seeing it at its worst, she was like, "This is perfect. This is part of self-care." And being there really is. We do gratefulness in the morning, every morning, "What are you grateful for today?" And people are like, "I can't think of anything new. I too am grateful for walking on the beach this morning." "I too am grateful for seeing the sunrise over the ocean." And I just had a student recently who was taking a few of my classes, and she called me up on a Monday, and class started on a Friday, a standalone class. And she said, "Do you still have room? I just need a weekend at the beach." So the beach is part of the self care. We do have self care in it. And part of it is too, we are overworked. We are stretched thin as veterinarians. It's part of our personality. It's part of what attracts us. So, like in our food self-care, I teach making foods simply that are healthy and more nourishing and less expensive, and stupid things like making your own almond milk. And it's not stupid if you've never done it and you don't know how easy it is to make your own peanut butter and your own almond milk and whatever. So teaching some of these simple skills goes a long way for people in their self-care. And we do breathing exercises, and had somebody else who made house calls, and he said whenever he'd get tired, he'd get out and on the side of the road and do breathing, and we do stretch breaks, and he'd do some of the exercises. He'd morph them into what worked for him, and he would just stop on the side of the road doing breathing and exercises, and it makes him safer while he's driving around. So
Yeah.
that makes my heart happy. So
What is it that you like best about teaching?
I love it when the students have those moments where it's not just things fall into place, but something really like shifts for them. And I see that a lot. I had a student in my very, very first class, and she didn't speak. She talked like this, and you couldn't ever hear her, and she had no personality. And she seemed very sweet, but nobody really knew her. And in November, we take a break from November to March. And in November, we were at the top of a staircase. I'll never forget it. And she walks by me and she's like, "Goodbye. I'll see you in March. I'm going to quit my job." And she just kept walking. And I'm like, what just happened here? And she came back in March, and she had quit her job, and she spoke and she interacted and she was bright. And she's now one of my friends. I love her. Those are the things that I love the most, when something really shifts for somebody in the class. And it doesn't have to be that they become an herbalist,
Yeah.
but it's just that I give them something that enhances their life. That's the most satisfying thing.
Wow. Like
Yeah.
transformation in front of you.
And that she's not the only one. She was the
Yeah.
first, but she's not been the only one that's had a significant transformation in the class. So
Well,
not
that's
everyone does. Some
yeah.
people take it and walk away, but there are those people who are ready for something and they find it.
I
Yeah.
love hearing that. And then, I mean, because you sounded very, very busy. And one of the things that you mentioned that you were so excited you were able to do is to be with your kids at their events.
Yes.
I think it's your younger son who's the swimmer.
My older
Older
son.
son. Okay, I got 'em mixed up.
That's
Your older
okay.
son was the swimmer, and you would bring laptops to the swim meets and things like that, but what does that mean to you now that you've kind of gotten into this part of your career? Are you finding that right balance, that right amount of living out your values? I'll say that.
Yes, I really feel like I have. I hope, I don't think my kids are far enough away from it yet to have an opinion of if it worked for them. But when I did close because by then I had a brick and mortar practice, and, so it was evenings and weekends and all the times that they needed me around. And when I did close that, I said to them, "Look, I will be totally available when I'm home. I'm going to be not home quite as much, but when I'm home, I'm all yours." And so, yes, writing lecture, reading research articles from PubMed, I can do that at the side of a pool. And my younger son has taken up tennis. I can do that at the side of a tennis court. And so I've spent a lot of my time writing lecture, dragging around bags of research articles and books and, big laptop, and doing it wherever they are and being able to be where they need me. And I've also set up my courses to be kind of on an academic calendar. So, and it also works in the Outer Banks. I teach September through November, and then I teach President's Day through the end of April. The Outer Banks, in the summer, it's expensive, it's crowded, it's not a good time to be down there. And in the winter, from Thanksgiving until President's Day, everything shuts down. That's when the locals take their vacations and things like that. So it's not a great time to be down there. So between that schedule and kids' schedule, it works. So like I came home a week before Thanksgiving. And, I was able to have Thanksgiving and see my college son and go to one of his swim meets and just be able to be really present with him and enjoy time with him. And it's been really a good schedule, I feel like.
Again, I mentioned that you do lots of talks where you're presenting to lots of different audiences, but especially in the veterinary community. I'm excited to be in a time where I think there are so many different possibilities to live out different careers that feed your values, feed your interest. You, with this veterinary background, you could go and do whatever. But sometimes it can be hard to do things that are non-traditional, that are outside of the box. That's why I have this podcast is talking about, it is okay. You think outside that box. But because it can be hard to do things that people don't quite understand because you don't fit their definition of what's in their head. Going into integrative medicine, it's not the streamline. So, have you experienced those times when people just didn't understand? And how did you deal with that so that we can kind of share that with people who might also want to try something that's a little bit different?
I think you have to have a thick skin, and I think you have to be centered in who you are and not let other people determine your value and all of that. I mean, I think that's just the bottom line. But I will say this, when I started and I would go to traditional biopharmaceutical veterinary continuing ed conferences, people would walk by and laugh at me, like blatantly. And it's funny you say this because I said to one of my good friends that I go to conferences with, this last one I went to, I think is the first time I've ever gone to this specific series of conferences and not been laughed at all by anybody. I think the tide is really turning, and somebody has to make that tide turn. And it's not just me. I mean, there are lots of other fabulous veterinary herbalists. I am not alone in this venture. And I think that helps too. When you go back to your three, as I tell my students, I can name way more than three herbal vets that are using, gymnema for diabetes, for example, and that not just my students, people who were using it way even before me. I have a set of mentors in the veterinary world too. Having that community helps, but I think just, you have to know that you're doing something important, and somebody has to lead in these things, or things don't change without leaders. So I'm comfortable being part of the forefront of that.
That was beautifully said.
Thank you.
Before we go into like our final questions, is there anything else that you have on your heart or mind when it comes to just the veterinary community in general? Anything you're either excited about for veterinary medicine or something maybe that you just want to share, kind of words of wisdom to colleagues?
I do want to say to colleagues that I get a lot of people who comment that their clients are using herbal supplements. The traditional thing you hear from people who aren't interested in herbs is either that they don't work or that they're toxic. Well, first of all, nothing can not work and be toxic at the same time. It's either having an effect or it's not. And one of the things that I think is really important is herbs are medicine. In fact, 75% of our top 150 biopharmaceuticals are derived from plants. The difference is a biopharmaceutical is one phytochemical and the plant has multiple, but we're still focused on that same primary chemical. So it's really not that different. People think it's something completely different, but it's really the start of pharmaceutical medicine, unquestionably. I think that's really important. And in that, I think that we get sued for everything, right? The kid gets roundworms because they decline dewormer and it's our fault. And in the same way, there are contraindications and drug herb interactions because herbs are medicine and things like that. And I'm concerned that our colleagues are going to get sued for not knowing enough about herbs. And I'm not saying they need to take a class on the level of mine if they're not looking to practice herbal medicine. But I think that vets need to figure out what these herbs are doing and figure out what effects they're having when they're prescribing medicines before terrible things happen.
So the inner nutritionist always comes up in me. It says, "This is why it's so important to get a really good diet history, including all supplements and everything." And then
Yep.
once you have that, then you at least know where you're starting from. What are there like some like quick references if they're in the middle of something, a client comes in, they're on an herb, they have no idea what this means. Is there a reference that in clinic they can refer to?
So there's one book out. I'm actually in the process of writing a book because it's a little outdated and the authors have chosen not to update it. But it's a really, really great text, and it's called Veterinary Herbal Medicine by Barbara Frugere and Susan Wynn. And it has a whole section of each herb, and in that it has a safety section. So if you have nothing else, have that on your shelf, look up the herb, just read the safety, and you'll know a lot. But the other thing that happens is, where are they getting their herbs from? We teach quality control, and that's huge because herbs are dietary supplements, so everybody can sell them. And everything's not quality. And one thing that the veterinary industry has is called NASC, and it is really the oversight of all veterinary supplements. And if it has that label, then it's a good quality product. And if it doesn't, well, then I will not have any comment about it because I don't, unless I'm personally familiar with the company. I have herbal colleagues who are like, well, I have to research every company for everything my client brings in. No, you don't, any more than you have to research the Clavamox they're getting from Mexico, that's not Clavamox, right? I mean, I sell the herbs I sell because I know they're good, they're effective, they're what they say they are, etc. It is not my job to research what you are getting off Amazon. And I think, we need to know the good companies and what's quality and work with that. And one company that's really excellent that has a whole veterinary department is called Herbalist and Alchemist. And they have, they have wholesale accounts and all of that, and they support you and teach you not the medicine of it, but, they help you in getting started in an herbal practice in terms of the product.
Well, thank you so much. I just have a final few questions for you.
Sure.
Is there anything that people get wrong about you?
Probably. I think people think that I'm not fun. I think once you get to know me, I like to have fun.
Well, maybe that can help with the second question. The second question is, do you have a hidden skill or interest?
My whole life revolves around, it's kind of so all encompassing. I have gardens, I love to cook, I love to take care of my animals. I have the horses and the goats. So I feel like everything I enjoy in life kind of revolves around that farm steady, homesteady kind of thing.
Yeah.
Uh,
Is there anything that is on your bucket list that you would like to do?
travel is definitely always on my bucket list. So yes.
Any particular place you have towards the top?
Probably. There's so many places I wanna go. I will say this, I've done 2 herbal trips in Greece and been to Greece 3 times, including with Dr. Carol Falk. We went for 3 weeks when we graduated veterinary school before either of us started working, and it is definitely a place my heart is, and I could always go back to Greece any day of the week, so,
That is
yes.
on my bucket list. I want to go to Greece very, very badly.
Email me when you do, I've been 3 times, so.
And finally, what is something you are most grateful for?
Probably my husband and my family and the fact that I get to do all this for a living. They say if you love what you do, you never work a day in your life. And I would say that is really accurate for me.